You probably read a story called Number the Stars.
Yeah.
Remember that? That's the story of Denmark. The Danish people decided that this is wrong. That's because Denmark, everybody was a Dane. There were Danes who were Catholics, not too many of those, mostly Lutheran, and there was a small group of Jews, but they also were Danes. They called them the Danes of the Mosaic persuasion. They had to do with the laws of Moses, I guess. And they said, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. They found out that the Jews will be, through a set of interesting circumstances, will be shipped out. A bunch of ships came in, empty ones, and they were going to be shipped out to Poland, where the death camps were. And so what they did is told the Jews to get out. And put them into fishing boats and ferried them across to Sweden. Now, Sweden was a neutral country, and that's a historical story that you can discuss why it was important for Germany to have Sweden as a friend, sort of, because they produced the best steel necessary to make ball bearings. You know what those are? In your car you have ball bearings.
And they roll the steel, they don't do that. Yeah, and then roll the blades.
You roll your ball bearing, and you need very high quality steel. So they figured, they also had other stuff. So they remained independent, but supported. But at the same time, the Jews of Sweden were not touched because they were independent. And so there were about 6,000 or 7,000 Jews living in Denmark, and except for about 200, they were all ferried across the bay there to Sweden and survived.
So they a lot of prepared questions for you, and they want you to find out. Go ahead. You want to go in order? Anyone have any questions about the beginning of the book? Okay.
Okay.
We'll start with the beginning.
So,
It's easy.
so my favorite part of the book is in the beginning when you talk about just like going to school, like normal childhood experiences, and something that kind of stood out to me is when you talk about. My friends. One of the things that really stood out to me is when you talk about like kids at school like getting into like little fights with each other, right? Because that's like, I guess you could say like a normal problem we all have, and then that like in comparison to the things you go through later in the book, it's just so crazy how like someone's problems, how drastically are changed. So I guess my question was, after seeing like small problems in the beginning of your life and so quickly getting to bigger problems, how did your how did your perspective change? I guess did things seem like not as big of problems after what you went through?
It happens step by step. And what you do is you try to figure out how to exist. Now, one of the things that my parents did was very straightforward. They said, wait a minute, this is not good. So what do? You leave. Okay, but there's one physics that says that if you leave one place, you have to go someplace else. Right? It's a small detail. But you have to be allowed to go there. There was no place to go. America had tremendously restrictive laws by 1939. They were passed in 1921 and then later on modified to reduce the number of people. And there was in addition to just the laws, the consulates throughout the world, in Europe particularly, were told, try to put all kinds of restrictions and changes of the law not to allow Jews to come here. Because there was a very, very strong anti-Semitic sentiment in America. They didn't want foreigners in general, but particularly Jews. And unfortunately, the government of the United States, including the President of the United States, remember him, FDR? And the person who really is responsible for not allowing Jews during this most horrendous period to come here is they came up with an expression. It's always propaganda. The answer was, we're going to win the war and we're going to punish the guilty. Meanwhile, keep killing the Jews. There was an act in the United States called the
Wayne Rogers,
not Wayne
Wagner Rogers.
the Roger and the
Wagner.
Wagner Rogers Act was introduced in the Congress of the United States, and what it said, will allow 20,000 Jewish children to come to America outside of the quota. That bill never came out of committee. In fact, one of FDR's cousins said very clearly, he says, the problem with these kids is they're cute, they're wonderful, but in a few years, they're going to be just ugly Jews. Make sure you don't get them.
I think what you were asking them, right, is when you're a little boy and your girlfriend stopped talking to you because you were Jewish, that was a very big thing to you. But then you get to Auschwitz and you're 14 and all of a sudden you're in a barn and you're taking care of horses. Did the problems when you were younger, did the perspective change once you hit Auschwitz and you saw smokestacks? Is that?
That, of course, changed because the objective was to stay alive. And for instance, one of the things that horses, they get fed, but the horses can't talk. So if I take a sugar beet from a horse, he won't know. He may know, but he ain't gonna tell anybody. And so you could supplement your diet. So you try to the extent possible to try and get additional food or not be in limelight. You worked out the system as best you could, not to be obvious and stand out there. And so that's part of the deal, is that you try to survive. Now, stealing from a horse was not called stealing. That was called organizing.
Any other questions from the beginning, before he moves to Hungary? Or any unanswered questions about the beginning of the book?
How were the
Nuremberg laws.
How were they introduced to you as a child? Like, did you understand what it meant and like why it was happening?
Well, I didn't understand what it meant fully when I was 5 years old. Because, 5 years old. 1934, I was 5 years old. I didn't understand them. I didn't worry about them. Why? Because it didn't apply to me because I was living in Czechoslovakia. By the time I'm 8, 9 years old, there's the issue of expansion of Germany, and will they destroy Czechoslovakia, and will that country stop being a democracy, and will my rights be taken away? I understood that. But the time I'm 10 years old, the government of Slovakia changes, they're elected, the Nazi government is elected, and it affects me directly. I can't get into, the first thing I know, there's a big sign on the park, I can't go in because I'm a Jew. I can't go into the swimming pool, to the beach because I'm a Jew. And one day I had to turn my sheepskin jacket into the police department because it's a luxury and I as a Jew am not allowed to have a sheepskin jacket. So you face these things and you try to get around it. When we were all thrown out of school, the parents or Jewish parents got together and said, hey, we have a Jewish school, a Hebrew school, where kids go study religion and all that, but that's only in the afternoon. So in the mornings, we're going to convert it to a regular school. Jewish teachers were fired, so now we have plenty of teachers, and we'll establish our own school. So you try to get around it. As you saw, my father tried to, because the Jewish businesses were taken away, right? You try to get around it. My father tries to get around it by asking one of his friends, Christian friends, to borrow his name, basically. But eventually his friend says, hey, wait a minute, this looks like a pretty good deal. I'm sure Joey's a nice guy. He's been friends with him for 20 years or so. But hey, it's my business, in my name. So why don't I keep Joe as an employee having managed this thing, and let me pocket the money. Greed.
Any questions about the transition from Slovakia to Hungary? Because I think I would love them to know firsthand the story you told me personally about when you had to bribe was it the conductor or the customs inspector?
Yeah.
Customs inspector.
Yeah.
So
So here we are. What happened is, remember the borders changed. Okay, so I live in Slovakia, and but my father was born what is now Hungary. So he is essentially a Hungarian citizen, right? So we go through the process, paying people off, of course, along the way, and suddenly my father becomes a Hungarian citizen, and the Hungarian Jews are not being shipped out, right? So because he's a Hungarian citizen, so is his wife, so are his two sons, not his father and mother-in-law. So we get a Hungarian citizenship, and therefore you get a Hungarian passport. And Hungary is okay for the Jews. So we managed to get across the border. But we have furniture to bring along. Now you have to go through customs, right? So how do you make sure that the customs official doesn't say, hey, you can't bring this in? You mean you have a credenza and you have two credenzas? No, you can't, not allowed to do that. But we want to do it. So what do? You pay people off. And somehow my father found out that this particular customs official was in charge, likes good chocolate and good whiskey and good salami. So he managed on the black market to get all that, put it into the suitcase. So we get to the border, and now we have to somehow take that suitcase to the office of the chief inspector, right? Now, if my father would have done it, he'd probably be arrested by somebody. But a kid, who cares? So I was elected to do that. So here I am, carrying this good-sized suitcase with all that good stuff.
You're about 11, right?
I am now, no, I'm already 12. Yeah, I'm 12
years old.
Still pretty.
So I take the thing, go along, go into the building, nobody stops me, I go into the inspector's office and drop it. There, say, we have some stuff we'd like you to have. Thank you very much. And so he himself was the inspector who didn't let anybody else look into the wagon which had all the stuff. And he just came out and stamped it and stamped a piece of paper and off it goes. Now, the one other small detail, when the government of Slovakia started taking away the businesses, they also said, wait a minute, Jews have bank accounts. We're going to freeze them. It doesn't belong to them anymore. So you kind of heard the rumor. So what you did is try to get the money out before the law comes into being. So now you have a whole bunch of cash. What do you do with the cash? I mean, you know that the policeman anytime can walk into your house and go and look for valuables, including cash. So what do? You give the cash to Irving, he puts it in his pocket and carries out huge amounts of cash. So nobody's going to bother the kid.
So you were the briber. You were the one in charge of bribing.
Right, and you know, if my father needs some money, I pull it out and give it to him, right? So you try to get around. And one of the other details that I think I described in the book, that one day a number of young Jews appear in the morning when we come to class. Number from someplace else, not locals. Maybe 20-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 22-year-olds. They escaped from Poland where the Jews were being murdered, and they come to our town. So they somehow found out that there's a school, so they, in the middle of the night, they get into the school. And they're hiding there, basically. But they have to eat. So the word goes out. Jewish families who are still there need to feed them. So I go to school. When you go to school, you have to bring a lunch along, right? And I happen to be a big eater. So I bring a whole thing. I remember we had these things in Europe where people would take, and it had like a canister and then top of another sort of. And so you would bring soup, and you bring in meat for the people who were hiding there in the school. And after we figured out what to do with them, they went to different people's homes. So we had one of those wonderful ladies who was like about 18, 19 years old, who lived with us. And how could she walk around and all that? Well, we said, she's from another town, she's not Jewish, we got some false papers for her. Turns out she survived.
So your family rescued themselves and somebody else.
So you try to help.
Let's go to Deborah. Had a couple of really. Didn't you have a couple of questions you want to ask?
One is about the egg.
Okay. Well, do I need you anything before the end? Okay.
So while you and your brother Bondi were living in the deaf camps, did you only communicate with your brother, or you also made close friends with other workers and Jews that you guys lived with?
The problem of making friends. I worked with horses, therefore I worked in a stable, and I had my 2 horses assigned to me, and there was another kid next to me with horses. So you talk. But I mentioned to you the fact there was things called selections, and one night, when we come back, this kid next to me, my age, didn't make the selection. So here's a kid that I became friends with. I cared about him and he cared about me. And now I know he's gone, he's dead. Painful. So you tried not necessarily to be very close to people because you know you can have pain.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. But speak a little louder because even though with my hearing
You got
aids.
your interpreter next to you, no worries.
So as you have included in the book, there are people called Muslimen, which are very thin and weak. Are they forced to work like you guys, or are they staying in bed or waiting?
Well, the problem with becoming a Muslim, which means you didn't care anymore and you didn't take care of yourself, and most of them died very quickly. But there was also selections, of course. You'd selections that you were gone.
Wouldn't you say that was the name they gave to people that they felt were on their way out?
Musliman. Now, what is a Musliman in German? It's a Muslim man. Because for some reason the Europeans thought that Muslims were very skinny. which I'm not sure is true. But you used words to describe things. Like I told you, you didn't steal from the horse, or from, if you worked in a bakery, you didn't steal, you organized. Stealing had to do with the fact that if you didn't eat your bread that night, and I knew that, and I took it from you, that's stealing. That, while it took place, it was frowned upon. And in Buchenwald, the feeding was like very minimal. And one night somebody was trying to steal something from another guy. And of course they made noise. And so he was restrained, the guy who was trying to steal was restrained. So the question is, why are you doing that? Right? The elders, some people who were sort of like quasi in charge of the moral and ethical aspects of it, they decided what we're going to do is take this guy and strap him down so he can't move, and the whole barracks will go around him and spit on him.
Shame.
Not to allow us to become animals like they wanted us to become. Because they wanted us to behave like animals. Probably the most difficult thing is to remain human under these conditions. Imagine saying, no, we're not going to steal from each other. Observe. When you're hungry, I know that you have a piece of bread which you saved for yourself. Not to take it away. Take strength.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question.
I have a bunch. Alright, on page 117, like there's a letter that your mom sent to the Red Cross showing that your brother's name was I can't pronounce it, but Andre Roth. It's like, why do you call him Bondi?
It's a nickname.
It's a nickname?
It's a standard nickname. Andre or Andrew, the nickname in Hungarian or Slovak is Bondi. It's like Robert is Bob and
Yeah.
William is Dick or whatever.
Some answers can be simple.
Yeah.
So like in the concentration camps, like you seem to like know like the time, you seem to know the dates, and like on page 97, you figured out like the President Roosevelt was dead. So like how did you like get the news, and how did you like keep track of time and dates?
Time was very simple. People, and not only they keep time, there's some people who are keeping the dates and Jewish holidays. You read about the Jewish holiday. So how did I know? Well, there were people who did that to make sure that we remain Jews and union. So that's one. And there's another piece to it. What was the other question?
It was about like the news, like when the
Oh,
President.
they
So
did.
you get the news.
Roosevelt.
Okay. How did we know what was going on? Well, in terms of the war, that was very simple, because so we worked. But in addition to which, on Sundays, even though we worked only in the morning with the horses, in the afternoon we would be assigned to go and clean the billets, the people that where the soldiers lived, where the guards lived. Which, by the way, was a good job, because you also cleared the garbage out. There are two things you found in garbage: leftover food and newspapers. So a German newspaper, of course. So from the German newspaper you can deduce what's going on in the war. Why? Because so you read it one week and it says that the German people, have reestablished a defensive line on the eastern end of Warsaw, and we will defend Warsaw. But the Russians came across Warsaw. So then the next thing you read, a week later or 10 days later, We have reestablished the defensive line on the western part of Warsaw. So you knew that the Russian army went from east to west. They took over Warsaw. So looking at that kind of stuff, by looking at things, you were able to deduce what was going on. In addition to which, I remember they were in Auschwitz, like other places, there were, in addition to Jews, there were a small number of other people. But the Jews were murdered, primarily. Small number of Jews survived. But there were many other people who were prisoners. There were German prisoners, primarily homosexuals and murderers, in Auschwitz. In fact, the German homosexuals were primarily responsible for what was called as Blockältester, which means that you were in charge of the whole building, and not a superintendent, because you had people for that working for you. You were like in charge. And so, of course, most of them were German. The Kapos, the KZ-Polizei, which is the camp police, who marched you out and brought you back, and were mostly Poles and Germans. There are a few Jewish Kapos, not too many, because in the camp itself there was a ranking system. The best jobs were held by Germans, prisoners by Germans. Germans, if you were the Blockältester, obviously you did not sleep on one of those shelves, as I call them. You had your own room. You had your little kitchen. Because you got packages from home. You have an orderly. And if you're a homosexual, you had usually a kid who was your whatever.
Any other question? Another question?
Yeah. So on like throughout the whole entire book and throughout like your whole life, like there's one part where you said like did it make sense to praise God? But was that like the only time where you questioned God? Like, and questioned Judaism?
Yeah. I did question, and wait a minute, like, come on, like, why is this happening? And as time went on, of course, after that, the question is still the same. But then I thought about it some more philosophically. God did not design the gas chamber. People did. If you look at the Bible, it tells you God gives you free will. He says, I give you life and I give you death. I give you evil and you give good. Choose life. But not everybody does that. Some people commit suicide, and some people murder other people. And through propaganda, you can convince people to do the most bizarre things. The real scary part is that murder, mass murder, became very patriotic. If you're really a patriotic German who believes in the system that you voted for, and the system tells you that's moral to murder Jews, it's individual people who are responsible for this. Over the years, of course, you see documents. I also copies of the design of the gas chambers. Those copies of the design on the right-hand bottom had the designer's name, and it was not God. And that's the real fear. Today, there are people in the world who want to murder other people. A few months ago, a guy walks into a synagogue in Pittsburgh and slaughters a bunch of people at prayer. Where does he get that from? It's called propaganda. The other day, the guy goes to a synagogue in California and murders one person and hurts a whole bunch of other people. Propaganda. He thinks what he's doing is appropriate. There's a whole country called Iran who wants to murder every single Jew in Israel. When they have a parade, a military parade, they parade missiles. And the missiles have addresses on it. Tel Aviv, Haifa. All for the greater glory of Iran. Because the objective is to get rid of the little devil called the Jews.
You said they're doing it for the patriotic, they're doing this for their country. That's what's going on.
Let's go to Lauren's question. Yes? Okay.
Why do you think it's important that like places like Auschwitz should remain open?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One of them, there is a whole group of people who are reasonably well financed who say this never happened. This whole thing I told you is fiction made up by the Jews. There are intelligent professors at universities who write books saying this is all fiction. There's a professor at the University of Northwestern University, you know that is, in Chicago. Who do them? The hoax of the 20th century. The Holocaust. It's a hoax. So one reason is that. The other reason is here you sit in a wonderful place called Mineola, and I tell you the story, and you read about it, and you say, yeah, I believe it. There were some evil people. How many? 7? 200? And then you come to Auschwitz, and you give a look at the small gas chamber and crematorium, and you see the way it was mechanized. That's a small one. You need an engineer to do this. So there were people with PhDs, educated people, who listened to music, who loved their children, out of patriotism, they designed things to murder the Jews. And to give you an idea of the sophistication required. At the very beginning, when they didn't build gas chambers yet, they said, hey, it's easy, we've been doing things of that nature. You see, one of the problems, as we spoke at the very beginning, saying that people who are take up space and material on this earth, and they're useless. And we feed them. We have institutions for them. This is silly. Why don't we get rid of them? It doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a German or whatever. And they developed a technique for that. It was called the T4 program. And what it had to do with is they had these institutions, insane asylums, and they wanted to get rid of these people. So what did you do? How did you do that? Imagine you're a German family from 17 generations, and unfortunately one of their kids or one of the adults is physically or mentally handicapped. So he's kept in an institution, which costs money. So what do? We gotta get rid of him. So how do you kill him and tell this German family, we just killed your cousin, your brother? It doesn't look. So they came up with this very clever scheme. They would send a letter to the family saying, you know, your son has been here for 6 months or 17 years or whatever, and we really don't have the facilities here to really take care of him properly. So we will shift him to another facility 50 miles down the road. So it's okay with you, right? So you give him permission to do that. Because you want the best facilities. So what do? You put him into a van, which is totally sealed, and on the way you pump carbon monoxide into the van, and all the people inside die. And then they arrive in this new place, and there is a doctor there and examines the bodies and puts together a death certificate saying in the process of going from A to B, he had a heart attack. And here are the ashes. So they used vans. So when they began the idea of killing Jews using gas, they did the same thing. But rather than having small vans, they had big vans. You know, like the kind that carry furniture, they're totally sealed. So now you get these people, maybe 100 people, in a van. You start pumping carbon monoxide. Well, you can't breathe. So what do people do? They push towards where the door used to be, which is locked by the way. But the door is sometimes in the back, and it disturbs the balance of the van, and it flips over. And so you have bodies all over the road. That's not good. So you have to redesign the suspension of the van in such a way that it doesn't matter how you shift the weight around. It won't flip over. Those of you, any engineers around here? That's a very, very difficult problem. Particularly in those days. Very sophisticated engineers with PhDs redesigned these vans. They have a sophisticated suspension system that it didn't matter where how the distribution of the weight was, just not to flip over. They really went to great lengths.
Let me ask one last question.
Yeah. There were some times, like in the book, when you thought like you were going to die, and you said that you didn't panic. And I'm just like, I want to know, like, how did you not panic? Like, if you literally thought you were going to die, like, you were running.
I don't know. Nobody panicked. We were all inside this hallway, and so I turned to my brother and said, you know, like, you're gonna kill us. It's a ruse. They gave us a shower for what? To kill us? Ridiculous, but to make sure there's no panic. Very important not to have panic, because if you have panic, people start running around like chicken without a head, and then you can't organize it nicely. They don't walk into the gas chamber. They're liable to run around and not to shoot them, which we can do, but it takes bullets and it gets to be very complicated. The whole point was to keep things organized. So you have to set it up in a way. That's why we arrived this place called Auschwitz or Majdanek or some of the other places. They said, we've been in a train for 3 days or a week. People from Saloniki.
Well, that was a couple of weeks.
That was a couple of
That
weeks.
was a couple of weeks.
In a boxcar. You were there for a couple of weeks. You didn't wash because there was no water. And so you gotta take a shower.
There's a lot of theater involved to keep everybody calm.
Tremendous. The facade was absolutely
Which
marvelous.
you didn't
So
mention
you,
it. yeah.
so did you believe, like, when she's saying, like, there were times where you could have been on the cusp of death, but you didn't believe it, or you knew, but you believed in the facade? Because sometimes it's reassuring to believe in the facade.
Somewhat the facade, but not really, because in Auschwitz itself, you knew
What it was.
if there is a selection that you
Right.
might not survive.
Yeah.
One question I really wanted to ask was, towards the end of the book, it obviously tells about how your brother Bondi was selected to go with a group of boys because they were the tallest, the strongest, and throughout the entire end of the book, there was like this question of like, is Bondi okay? What's happened to him? And in the epilogue, you also talk about how you thought you saw him train. And I just wanted to ask, I guess you never really had the chance to know for sure what happened to Bondi, and I just wanted to ask, how you were able to cope with that for so many years now. Was it how hard it was?
I guess the way I cope with it in a way is that I talk about it.
Then you also know what happened.
I know what happened to him. But I talk about him, and in a sense, I do that because if I talk about him, for the moment, he's here. Not physically, obviously. But at least he didn't just disappear. He just didn't. He was and he's gone and no one knows. So it's important for me to think about it and to talk about it. And I do that. I do that in the book, I do that.
Well, I have 3 good questions. And I think I could ask you personally, but I think it would be good for the students to hear the answers. So thanks for coming. If you guys have another minute, you might want to hear the answer to this. So the first thing you can probably answer quickly is that a lot of the Holocaust deniers, especially with the internet now, a lot of their propaganda, like you're mentioning, is getting spread. And one of the main arguments that they use is that they say that, yeah, maybe it happened, but the numbers were exaggerated. So what is your response to the numbers?
My response to the numbers is as follows. During the period of time when trains move, there's a record of the train. The number of people was in the manifest. The number of trains, there's a manifest. The number of people that lived in Europe, the number of Jews that lived in Europe, the census. It's all a fact. But they don't care. They make up stories. Look, some of the most bizarre things people make up, and we believe them. To give you the extreme. In the 12th century, in England, one day before Easter week, Holy Week, a Christian child is found dead. And so you would think that you would investigate and see what happened, right? They didn't do that. They said, oh, the reason the Christian child is dead is because Jews need the blood of Christians, preferably children, to bake matzah. You know what matzah is? That stuff that tastes like straw. Now, those of you who don't know, matzah is a mixture of flour and water.
No red in it at all.
What's that?
There's no red in there.
No red.
That red-
Not even salt. Now what you do is you take flour and water, you mix them together, and 18 minutes later, it has to be already a baked matzah. Because if it isn't, the idea is that it may have the yeast, the natural yeast must have it can rise and all that. So you're talking about, now, I mean, this is how you bake matzah. And I don't know that because I've done it. How does anyone come up with this? Okay. Now, you're talking the 12th century in England. But in 1993, that's, you were not quite born yet. But 1993 for me is not very long time. The president of Syria had a guest, a delegation from Rome. And with the delegation was the Pope. And of course he greeted them and gave a speech. And in the speech he says very clearly that, as your holiness know, the Jews have used the blood of our children to bake matzah. And they're still doing it.
Let's take a couple more questions.
Okay.
And then if anyone has a test and has to run, okay. We got you back.
Okay. You mentioned a lot of civilians, right? The civilians voted these Nazis into power. And many of the Nazis survived after the war, right? So the hatred and the stereotypes that were in their heart and in their mind, must have still been there afterward. Can these stereotypes and hatred that's in people's minds and hearts be changed? How? I guess my question is, how can Jews still go along with those that, the hatred and the stereotypes still exist? How do you change these hatreds and stereotypes? Because it's not just Jews that still have hatred and stereotypes against them.
Some people you can't change. There is a concept in Judaism called, freely translated, returning to basic morality. It's called Shuvah. And as long as one is alive, we can do that. There is also always the question of forgiveness. That's another issue which I'll discuss in some detail. Unfortunately, there are those who have never changed. I was giving a talk to a group of teachers from a place called Innsbruck, Austria. They took a course which was taught in Innsbruck, Austria, but they came for graduation here, and I was asked to speak to them about my experiences. And one of the teachers, whose daughter was sitting next to her and her husband, she says, you're talking 1994, 94. And one of the teachers says, my father-in-law, who's still alive, remained a Nazi. Even today, when anything goes wrong, he says it's the Jews that are at fault. Now here's my daughter. I want my daughter to love her grandfather. But he's downright evil. So the problem really is, do people change? The answer is sometimes you can't give up. You can't say, well, too bad. And today there are millions of people in this world who want to murder other people. They don't change. Because the ideology and the theology says it's not only okay, but if you're a true believer, you will murder every infidel. Even if you have to die in the process. And that, my friends, is part of the problem.
My last question is that a lot of people ask, were there Jews that were being rounded up by the Nazis that tried to denounce their Judaism and say, I'll become a Christian? Why didn't they just try that? Or that was not an alternative because they...
That was not an alternative because the law was very specific. If you had 3 Jewish grandparents, those your parents are Christian because they
You're
converted.
Christian, and
What's
you're
that?
Christian.
And you're Christian, and you may be even a deacon in a church. But if 3 of your grandparents are Jewish, you are a Jew, and it's in your blood, which of course has absolutely nothing to do with science, but it's in your blood, and therefore you are a Jew, and you're to be exterminated. That was the philosophy, and that was basically what... Now, if you read, there's a book called Mein Kampf, written by Adolf Hitler. Mein Kampf means my struggle. To being somewhat prejudiced, I will say it also means jihad. In that book, he has a chapter which speaks of genetics. And he begins the chapter saying different species don't mate. A horse and a cow don't mate. Different species. The Jews are a different species. And therefore, God forbid. And the reason you don't do that, because when you have a child, that child will be equivalent to the lower species. Intellectually, physically, it's always like the lower species. So if you have a pure German, whose grandfather, great-grandfather, has intercourse with a Jew, the child will be of a lower intellect because he's a different species. This, my friends, was bought by the scientific world of Germany. How stupid can they be?
Right.
It was a world.
The world, by the
It
way,
was a world.
there's a place over here called Cold Springs Harbor.
It wasn't just Germany.
Right.
They came up with the idea in Cold Spring Harbor.
Right. And Tuskegee.
The whole genetics thing that people are of different species, and if you're of a particular species, you are a lower intellect. And not only that, by the way, your eyes are situated, the distance between the eyes, the shape of the forehead, and a whole bunch of other things identify you as a particular species. And you listen to this and say, this is the You could get a PhD at Columbia University in 1910 in that subject,
It's called eugenics.
for eugenics.
It's fake science, but that's what it was back then. It was real
I mean,
science.
you're talking about how crazy. And the problem is, facts don't matter.
Josh, ask you a question?
So, in your book, you mentioned like getting angry or frustrated with 2 Germans that were arguing about the war after you were liberated, and then you said, what was the use in like arguing them and talking to them? You can't talk to every German. So then, how did you handle your anger from what happened? And did you keep it bottled up, or what did you do?
He talks a lot.
I talk a lot. I'm angry. No, I disagree with false ideas. I disagree with Mein Kampf. I read it, by the way, just to understand that I was giving a bunch of lectures in Germany, and one of the teachers, I told them, you're not supposed to read it, but if you happen to come across it, sneak and read. And one of them said, I read it. From the perspective of literature, he says, it's awful. It's an awful piece of work. And besides, it's a lot of humbug. And one of them said, I don't quite understand how my grandparents bought into this. And then, unfortunately, he came up with the answer. They lost World War I. They were angry, and they had depression, and inflation, and they had no jobs, so they're lashing out. Which means that he still believes in the fact that even though it's not true, but people have a reason to be evil. There's a cute story that I sometimes tell. You know, America is a free country. You can do whatever you want, right? So this guy comes to America, and he has arrived in the free country called New York, and he's walking along the street, and one day he's walking along, and he's seeing a guy, and he just does not like the way his face looks. He doesn't like him. He doesn't know him. Goes over to him and punches him in the nose. Obviously he bleeds. Obviously he calls over a policeman. He says, hey, this guy punched me in the nose. Lock him up. Gives him a summons, and of course it winds up in court. And so the judge says to the guy, says, why did you hit it? He said, I didn't like him, and this is a free country. I can do anything I want. It's free. I say, your freedom stops when the other fellow's nose begins. That we have to understand.
One more.
Like kind of the beginning of the book, when your father first got sick, you said that like everything happens for a reason. So do you think that like your experience when you went through it, there was a reason for it?
You get that?
No.
If everything happens for a reason, do you believe that everything you went through happened for a reason?
Yeah, it happened for a reason, because people just made up stories about me, which are absolute falsehoods, and that's why it happened. And, us humans have the capacity to believe the most phenomenal stuff, the most craziest possible things we can believe.
Have you ever thought of getting rid of your tattoo?
No,
Do you mind showing it to them?
not
So
at
they-
all.
So they,
The tattoo is part of my experience. It's like my wrinkles. I earned them. I never thought of it in the first place. Nowadays, of course, you have laser surgery, so it's not so bad. But years ago, you had to have a surgery, right? And I don't like surgery.
right.
You can understand that. And the guy comes with a scalp. So, and besides that, it's there, and people ask about it, and in a way, it's a symbol of the ultimate evil.
It's branding.
It's branding. It's saying you're not a person, you're my property. Just like a horse or a cow is branded, so am I, because I'm not a person, I'm property. And people need to understand that.
thank you so much for coming in for the first half of your day. Can I get a picture with them behind you? Would you mind? Okay.